Welcome to BookRising, a podcast by the Radical Books Collective. Hello and welcome to BookRising, our podcast. I'm so thrilled to have Véronique Tadjo joining us today, a truly prolific writer, poet, and artist who writes primarily in French. Véronique was born in Paris, but grew up in Abidjan in Ivory Coast. She also studied in Abidjan and in Paris, eventually earning a PhD in African American literature and civilization. She's had a run as an academic, teaching and researching at the University of Abidjan, as well as at Wits University in South Africa. I first encountered Véronique Tadjo's work when I learned that she was part of a group of 9 writers from various parts of Africa who went to Rwanda in the aftermath of the 1994 genocide and came together to bear witness and to insist on an obligation to write about what happened. Here she produced L'Ombre d'Imana, Voyage jusqu'au bout de Rwanda, which is Imana's shadow travels to the heart of Rwanda. And that was just one of her works that I started out reading. But she has an incredible amount that she has produced: 3 volumes of poetry, 6 novels, 10 children's books, many of which she has illustrated herself. And we just read her award-winning book, In the Company of Men, which is about Ebola, at our book club. And I'm so excited for this conversation. Thank you for joining us, Véronique.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me, Bhakti.
Of course, it's our honor. Yes, thank you. So, Véronique, you're in London at the moment, and I will, let's see what we can say, because you have such a wide range as an artist and such a diverse career. You're a poet, novelist, academic. You're a painter who illustrates your children's books. And this makes you very hard to pin down, because often when we think about writers, we are often habituated to think about, their 1 or maybe 2 nationalities. So maybe you can tell us a bit about your biography, your childhood, and the sort of give us a general arc that have led to the circumstances that make you this great amalgam of identities today.
Thank you. Well, first, I was born, as you said earlier, I was born in Paris of an Ivorian father and a French mother. So already, right from my birth, I had this duality. Then before independence, my father decided to take his young family back to his country, to Côte d'Ivoire. My brother was about 3 years old. I was 1. And so I was brought up in Côte d'Ivoire. And as I said, I was very aware that I possessed 2 cultures. But being in Côte d'Ivoire, growing up in Côte d'Ivoire during my very formative years, Africa is my home, and therefore most of my references and preoccupations and questions and issues are grounded in Africa, in West Africa and in Africa in general. Concerning poetry, I was kind of naturally drawn to poetry as a form of expression that suited my temperament. I remember my brother was more interested in, novels and music, and I was fairly introvert, I guess. So I would stay in my corner and read poetry. It just spoke to me strongly. Then I also decided to study English at the Department of Abidjan University. And after my BA, I went on to do a doctorate at the Sorbonne, Paris 4. And then later on, I furthered my research with a Fulbright scholarship at Howard University in Washington, D.C. Then I decided to go back to Côte d'Ivoire, and I went to teach English in a school in the far north of Côte d'Ivoire. Okay, I'll say Côte d'Ivoire or Ivory Coast. It apparently is Côte d'Ivoire.
Yeah.
Côte d'Ivoire. So I went back, but to the north, and I fell in love with the Senufo people who live in that region. And in fact, I wrote my first collection of poems, Latérite, which is Red Earth, when I was there. So one day I met a publisher who was starting a collection of books for children, for young people. And I wasn't going, I didn't have that in my mind, but because he asked me if I would be interested in writing for young people, I got to it. And so much so that the first book that I wrote was Lord of the Dance. And I illustrated the album. And that was the beginning of a long passion for writing for young children. Today, I write not just albums with illustrations. I also write for older age group. That means teenagers and even young adults.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's a good compressed arc. I think I read somewhere that you one of your parents was an artist, so I assume that you were surrounded by like art materials or something.
Yes, I had two very big influence in my growing up, in my childhood. There was on one side, my father was very politically involved because he worked in government. And my mother was an artist. So in the house, there was these two pools, the artistic pool and the kind of political, more socially conscious dimension.
Yeah, I mean, if there is a thread, I would say in your work, there the socio-political element is very strong. It's very easy to see why, say, the Radical Books Collective is attracted to you. I think you have a very radical literary imagination. And I guess, in a way, I would say that a lot of your works are concerned with sort of writing from below or writing about ordinary people. Yet, at the same time, when I hear about your background, I feel you're very cosmopolitan. You have access to many places in the world. The woke generation will say you're privileged. Yet you continue to stay focused and gaze upon ordinary people, and your topics are very social justice focused, very politically oriented. How do you kind of do both?
Maybe I can go back to my family again for that.
Sure.
In the sense that if you take my father, he was from a village, a very small village in the south of Côte d'Ivoire, near the Ghanaian border. So I was very, very aware of the differences in the levels of access between first the town, the city, and the village, and also the fact that people were living very, very modestly in the rural areas. So, and also you go to Abidjan, it's a big capital, but I mean, it's so many levels. It's easy to see that there's quite a lot of poverty, and it's a question. Maybe I always had my eyes open, and also maybe, as I said, because my father came from such a modest background, and then on my mother's side, she also came from a small village, but in Burgundy.
Oh wow!
And her family was in the wine. They were wine merchants. Okay, but her mother, my grandmother, was very religious. And so she was very, very, very concerned about injustice and that sort of thing, you know. And maybe so maybe it comes from there. But it has stayed with me. It's something you cannot really understand. It's difficult to explain. It's just that maybe it's a form of sensitivity. It's just the way you look at life. It's being. I know that I'm privileged, but my concern has always been: if you're privileged, what do you do with that privilege? And that has always been in my mind. You know, okay, you've been lucky, but what do you do with that? And I think that is what drives me to write this book and to continue with the different themes.
Mm-hmm. Do you think you're drawn to the concept of kind of committed literature or littérature engagée? You know, do you think we live in a world where there is still place for this?
Absolutely, that's exactly what I do think. Even if you take the Negritude movement, which is not supposed to be littérature engagée at first, but for me it is. It's just that they achieved something extraordinary, is that they managed to create a literature of high caliber, and at the same time fight for political progress in Africa, because they were fighting for independence, but they were writing literature. They were not writing pamphlets. They were not writing, didactical pieces. They were really writing literature, and I admire that. Although you can find all sorts of reasons why, they were not good for today, maybe. But I think for their time, they did what they had to do, and I really value that. And you take people like Césaire, Fanon. I mean, it's extraordinary what they've been able to achieve. And for me, it's littérature engagée. But I would be more like Baldwin, for example. For me, I was going to say the best, in the sense that his way of writing is completely engaged. But there's something so powerful, so lyrical, so human, that I find it extremely, it inspires me a lot. So yes, I think we just maybe have to find another name, another term. But I think, on the contrary, with all the crises we are living in, with that whole business of climate change, the health crisis, the economic crisis, the recession, and all that, we need a literature that's going to help us through that period.
Right. Yeah, I agree. I agree very much. To come back to the idea, say, of negritude, I see why you're drawn to, the negritude movement, and also the kind of formal experiments that took place. You are someone who thinks, I imagine you think a lot about form, especially on the one hand, because you write in several genres. You're also a painter, artist. So let's talk a little bit about form. So one thing easily that I can say is your books are often short, and you're partial to what we would call lyrical fragments and episodes, then the long singular narrative, though you have that as well. Why are you attracted to this literary approach?
I can't tell you why, but I am attracted to it, in the sense that, remember, we said that I started with poetry. My first book was a collection of poems. And so I consider myself as a poet. So writing fragments for me is something that allows me to continue with the poetry, because I like condensed language. I like condensed images. And so that's what I prefer. So I have a tendency to prune my narratives, as opposed to adding things or segments or lengthening the narration. I will always prune to the maximum.
Mm-hmm.
And fragments is because I think that in our life, fragments are closer to our experience as human beings, in the sense that our life is not linear.
Mm-hmm.
We think it is, but it's an illusion. It's the illusion of time.
Yeah.
But in reality, we have so much in our heads. We have, different lives, different opportunities. Everything is like turning around our heads. So, in fact, it's kind of trying to first say, look, our life is not linear, and second, it's at the same time trying to put order by taking out the fragments of our life.
Right. But there's something where you want to challenge the reader as well. I think you hinted at this at the book club, where I think some of us were saying that your Ebola book is very impactful, but at the same time, you're not deeply connected to the characters. We don't know their names. And you said your response was that it's important to kind of for the reader to challenge why they need certain information and things like that. So would you say you have a theory somewhere that descriptive, long-form storytelling, there's a critique somewhere that you are making of the other way of writing, very different from yours? You see what I mean?
Yes, maybe, because I like to give a lot of freedom to the reader. I like the reader to do his or her interpretation of the text of the story. And for me, I see reading and writing as proactive. And so I trust the readers, and I think that I like to leave room for interpretation. So as we were saying in the book club, if in the first fragment in the Ebola book, in the Company of Men, we find a doctor who's under his cosmonaut suit, his space suit, as I call it. And of course, you don't know who is under a space suit. It's for me, it's symbolical of the fact that you must look at what people do, not what they look like. You must consider what people do, not what they look like. We spend too much time just saying, who's that person? What does she look like? What color? Where does she come from? Well, it's just, and then we forget to take time to see actually what is happening. What is that person trying to do? So I am against these divisions that come right from the start.
Yeah.
Of course, you will understand after a while that that person is white or black. And as a joke, I say green or purple. But why I don't like it when right at the beginning you need that kind of certainty. I know that person. I can put a label on that person. It's the labeling that I don't like.
Yeah, maybe I'm badly prepared to interview you, but I haven't read your children's books or your young adult books. How does this idea translate there too? Because don't children need explanation, or are children just more free readers? How do you think about this within that?
Yes, I do play with color, but for example, in some of my children's books, you'll find an elephant that's pink, or a giraffe that's green, or a little boy that's who is yellow, or something like that. And sometimes I do play with colors, but you see, children are freer than adults because they don't have all these preconceptions. and stereotypes in their heads. So you can do a lot of things with them, and they will recognize what you're showing them, even if they're not like the conventional picture that you would normally give them. And so that's also why it's so rewarding to write with young people is because they have that openness of mind, which is
ability. Yeah. Okay. Let's talk a little bit more about Company of Men. In the Company of Men traces the story of Ebola through a host of human and non-human characters. And we asked you to make a reading list of books that inspired you as you were writing this book for Africa as a Country. And you said you were inspired primarily by oral literature, and this allowed you the freedom to go many places. And, and then because I was kind of rereading some of your books, I remembered that in L'Ombre d'Imana, Shadow of Imana, your book on Rwanda, there's a character who says, "Is Africa's orality a handicap to collective memory? We must write to give information some permanence." So there's a lot of debates, and these are old debates perhaps in orality studies, oral literature studies, and that we want to respect orality, oral cultures, but there are limitations as we come up against modernity and the permanence of written culture. Just, opening it up for any thoughts you have on these tensions.
Yeah. Well, when I wrote that quote in that sentence in Shadow of Imana, the Shadow of Imana, is just because we went there 4 years after the genocide, so it was very raw. It had just happened, and there was also a strong danger of denial. And so we as people who had gone to Kigali, who had gone to Rwanda to write about post-genocide Rwanda, we wanted to really write it down so that we could tell the world what we had seen. So in that sense, orality was not
an option.
It wasn't the immediate option. Today is different. Today, there are lots of books written by Rwandan writers, and also lots of testimonies. One of the healing process is to have people talk about their trauma, talk about what they experienced during the genocide, in order to make this real and to talk about it and exchange experiences, because you cannot write everything. That's also what I realized. You cannot write everything. So maybe when I, with time, I realized that the strong value of orality, and maybe what I'm trying to do is be at the junction of writing and orality.
Right.
But in terms of oral tradition, I'm just using the technique of oral tradition. Of course, a book is not oral unless you start reading it, which is also great. I think audio books are becoming very, very important.
Yeah.
Because and also an example comes to my mind: the spoken word, the spoken word of poetry.
Sure.
What is happening? It's a revival of poetry, because for a while poetry was stuck between the pages, and now it's back to the people. It's back to saying it aloud and having a public to listen. So orality can do things that writing cannot do. So I was very attracted by the technique of orality.
Yeah, absolutely. Just to follow up and to kind of touch upon some of your other works, which I've read, which is Queen Poku, also The Blind Kingdom, and sometimes I see an attraction there again to kind of oral cultures and to rework and reinterpret these legends of queens and queens. And, I often find myself feeling impatient sometimes when we're reviving royalty and monarchs. It's like, Beyonce is very attracted, for example, to like African royalty, and I feel like I don't know how these radical imaginaries can be activated unless we kind of just drop the kingdoms and the royalty and the monarchy, and I know that I'm not accusing you, but I know that you also write from below, but there are all these tensions that happen when one brings a figure, another queen figure or a king figure. How do you navigate all this?
Well, the thing is that you have to see those who bow to royalty and those who question royalty. I think I'm in the second category. I question royalty. That means I question power all the time.
Yeah.
And what I did with Queen Poku was to question the legend. And it's quite tricky because it's a myth of foundation. It's the myth of the foundation of the Baoulé people from Côte d'Ivoire. And the Baoulé people have been in power for, since the beginning of the birth of the nation. So they are very powerful people. So by questioning the very myth of their foundation, I was like shaking things a little bit, but that's what interested me. And also what interested me in the legend of Poku was the fact that she was a woman, and that there are not that many royalties that are women. And I wanted to say, look, this woman is supposed to be big, but in fact, she has no voice. Okay. And when you read the legend, the kind of the basis of the legend, Poku has no voice. That means as a woman, she doesn't exist. She just has this gender, but she's not a real woman in the sense that, for example, her sacrifice, the sacrifice of her only child, is like one line, and that's it. And then we move on to the creation of the kingdom, the Baoulé kingdom. So there were lots of things that I could say with this legend, but always questioning power and also the manipulation of power. That means it was so obvious that the myth of Poku was written or conceived by men. There was no way a woman could have come up with something like that. So my idea was to give her back her voice.
Sure. Yeah.
And concerning the Blind Kingdom, it's exactly the same thing. I was saying it's the kingdom of the blind in the sense that of people who refuse to see what's happening around them. So they're blind to the reality of life, and they stuck in their selfishness and oppression of people.
Absolutely. It's just good to hear you talk about it. I know that you're writing from the other perspective and questioning power. That's absolutely true. So coming to a final sort of question, though there might be follow-ups. So we are a collective that is attempting to confront kind of structural issues in publishing. And, traditionally, very little African writing has actually been published or celebrated. And I mean in the mainstream commercial sense. And it also falls under the category of African literature, which often doesn't make a lot of sense given how huge and varied the continent is. How do you explain these limitations given the amount of writing, stories, and art that is actually produced on the African continent? What historically do you think has been the obstacle, the impediment?
Well, Yeah, well, first I want to say that I have no problem with the category African literature, because there's been a big debate, why African literature? It should be literature on its own. Why do you want to add African? I don't understand the debate. And especially when I think of Japanese literature, Latin American literature, Russian literature, Chinese literature, why is it a problem when we're talking about African literature? One, I think that it's mainly a commercial question. It's a commercial issue. And it's a commercial issue within the Western world, the Western publishing industry. Is the idea that if you carry the burden of African literature, then you can't be a commercial writer. I mean, somebody who's going to sell books. And so I think that it's looking at the problem in the wrong way. I think that first you have to recognize that it's an industry, it's about money, and that the Western publishing industry is very protective of its territory first. That means the Western publishing industry will always think about its own interests first. Second, it will absorb over literature so long as they sell. And it's a kind of vicious circle because if you don't give enough visibility to people who are writing not from inside Europe or the Western world, but from abroad, then of course they're not going to sell. So, and then if they don't sell, then they're not going to be well positioned on bookshelves, in bookshops. But there's another issue as well, and it forces us to go back to Africa. We need to develop our literature in a more efficient way. I think that African literature has not reached its potential, very far from it, because we need to develop the readership, and we need to promote a culture of reading. And that is the work that we have to do. When, as African writers, we will have the weight of being recognized in our own countries, the rest will come more easily.
Right. Yeah, that's tough. And I think this is where, just to argue with you, the category of African literature becomes too quick, because what works for a Kenyan readership may not work for a Senegalese, or it's just like it's just so. And also historically, we're thinking of African literature often being analyzed for its sociological, anthropological themes in academic work.
But who does that? Who does that? It's because even the critics are in the majority from the Western world, Western. Yeah. So it's all the same thing. I think we haven't spent enough time to see what people want to read and why they want to read those books.
Yeah, I agree. I think publishing structures have to be strengthened, cultural institutions, and it does feel the last couple of decades that it has been changing. No?
Yes.
Do you feel that?
Absolutely, it's evolving a lot. There's a lot of good things happening. I think the educational sector is still the main sector, the main, money-making sector. So I think once publishers will realize that you can survive and thrive with literature, then it will be fine. It will be fine. But I mean, we have so many challenges that sometimes this is not understood as a priority. Whereas I think that developing a strong culture of reading is very important for the development of a country.
Okay, that's good. I think it's hopeful, it's happening. So I think we can, I'll just say thank you. I think this was very illuminating. You told us a lot. And thank you again for coming today.
Well, thank you very much for having me.